Hi everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm in London, so it's evening for me. And yes, this is 5 things I wish I'd known sooner about scaling teams and culture, but also systems, I think. And so a whole bunch of my career was just explained to you, but I started out as a hardware hacker in South Africa, which is where I'm from, despite my adoption of my wife's very British, very middle class accent these days. So my weird claim to fame is I built part of South Africa's first satellite as a teenager. So my parenting advice is very well researched, which is don't let your kids do anything cool when they're young. I soldered something that went into space when I was 15, and it's all been downhill since then. I also am really proud of chairing and curating the Lead Dev Conference, which runs in London, Berlin, San Francisco, and New York every year, and focuses on leadership for technical folks. But let's just dive straight in here. The first lesson I've learned, and probably the hardest one lesson, is that dry doesn't work for human communication. Don't repeat yourself a lovely programming principle, but it's a terrible human communication principle. You need to repeat important things consistently at least 7 times, is what some research shows. And though I'm a Pythonista by background, so I love dry as a programming principle, it really isn't helpful when you're trying to communicate with humans. Not least because humans often don't know what they don't know, or aren't aware of the things that they might not be aware of. This is the 5 orders of ignorance from Paul Downey. And one of the things I found in my career is that there's nothing engineers produce more of than code, other than, in the absence of information, conspiracy theories. It is very, very easy for there to be some really, really wild theories about what is going on in your organization if you don't communicate effectively and well enough. So be clear, be consistent, and remember that others still need to hear far beyond the point where you're worried that you've been repetitive. Especially if you're a leader, you need to be so bored of what you're saying, and you have to not just say it, but say it consistently in the same clear way in order to get your message across. And remember that we don't just communicate in the present. We use architectural decision records or systems designs and things like that. They can be really effective ways of communicating to the future what you were thinking about when you made a choice. I've worked on systems older than I am, not just legacy, but vintage. And I once was responsible in my early career for a mainframe system that had to be kept alive at all costs because they didn't have the code anymore. And there was one running instance and it had to stay alive. And I wish so much that I could go back in time and understand what the people who made some of those decisions that ended up in that situation had thought at the time. So write ADRs, remember that you're communicating with the future in a really effective way if you manage to get that right. The second thing that I've learned is that scaling teams is about creating the conditions for success. We all hate bad bosses, right? We talk about them as clueless, empty suits, pointless. The Dilbert pointy head boss is funny because they're so recognizable to all of us. We're all familiar with the seagull style of management: fly in, shout at everybody, shit on everything, fly away again. And hopefully none of us want to be that kind of leader, that kind of bad boss. This is usually a GIF that has a cat just increasingly shoving more and more things off a table, going fuck this, fuck that, fuck this thing in particular. And so when I became a manager, I decided that I just couldn't be terrible at it. And I was definitely better suited for an IC track, but there wasn't one where I worked. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go looking for advice and research and evidence because I'm a nerd. I like this from Katerina Fake, that there's 3 kinds of managers. The bullshit umbrella tries to protect their team. The bullshit funnel selects the person they least like and concentrates all of it on them. And the bullshit fan just spreads it all around indiscriminately. So minimum viable management is to be a decent bullshit umbrella. I actually, though, really like a much better analogy that Nick Means came up with, which is to be a great heat shield. Because I think that with the bullshit umbrella analogy, you start to go, well, you kind of want the umbrella to be semi-transparent so that people kind of know what's going on, but they're not dealing with it data, and it just gets very messy very quickly. And so think of it, I think a better metaphor these days is a heat shield. Everybody knows it's hot over there, but they're protected. But then I also went, as I said, looking for data and for research, because I'm a nerd and I like to learn from those who've come before. This is my favorite management book, which I appreciate makes me really a nerd. It's called First Break All the Rules, and it's from the 90s, but it's still super relevant, and I love it because it is immensely data based. It's a little American centric, but so is a lot of the world. And they interviewed 80,000 managers in over 400 companies, and they went looking for what made teams the best performing, not what made them happy, but what made them the highest performers. And the best performing teams answer certain questions positively. I appreciate this is both like a terribly designed slide, and it makes you feel like you're drowning. So rather than going through it point by point, knowing you will immediately forget all 12 things, let's zoom out and use a different framework to make this easier to remember. And that I've stolen from Dan Pink's book Drive, which is a great read if you haven't read it. There's it's essentially a review of all of the latest research in psychology of what makes people happy to go to work on a Monday morning, what motivates us really. And Dan Pink summarized this as that people need purpose, autonomy, and mastery. So purpose, do I believe in why we're here, what we're doing as a total organization? Autonomy, do I get a say in what? Do people listen to my opinions? And then mastery, am I proud of how I'm doing what I'm doing, of the craft of what I'm doing? And then take away any negative factors that detract. If you have a 4-hour commute each way to work, it's possible that no amount of purpose, autonomy, and mastery will make up for that, depending on the circumstances. And those questions I showed you earlier fit quite well into this framework. So one of the key ones is, does the mission or purpose of my company make me feel like my work is important? Do I know what's expected of me at work, and do my opinions seem to count at work? Are clearly autonomy questions. But I find it really interesting how many of these questions are about mastery. And I originally found this quite odd. And then I thought about my friends who were product managers and designers and engineers and data folks, and the reasons that they quit places. And I was like, actually, yes, I can see that mastery is really important. Those questions, do I have the materials and equipment I need to do my work right? It's a fairly 90s question. I think these days it would include like information and access to people. At work, do I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day? Is there someone at work who cares about my development? Are my coworkers committed to doing quality work, or do I feel like an island alone? In the last 6 months, have I talked with someone about my development? And at work, have I had opportunities to learn and grow? And remember, again, these are predictors of high performance, not predictors of happiness, but they feel like they could predict happiness very effectively as well. There's 3 questions that aren't included already. In the last 7 days, have I received recognition or praise for good work? Does my supervisor, it's very 90s, you're not my supervisor. Does my supervisor or someone at work seem to care about me as a person? And then, do I have a best friend at work? I love this last question because it doubles as a masterclass in cultural differences. No offense to anybody who's American who's watching, but that's apparently a fairly normal question to ask someone if you're in the US. The reaction in Northern Europe, where I have given this talk a couple of times, is fuck you, the company doesn't get to decide who my best friend can be. And so I have to translate it for anybody in Northern Europe as, is there anyone you work with who, even if the company's not paying, you would willingly spend time with? That's what a best friend at work means. And so I think this is about being respected and rewarded, being yourself and being successful. I call this inclusion. Camille Fournier calls it community. I think you can call it a number of different things. But it adds up to there being these sort of 4 elements that matter: purpose, autonomy, mastery, and inclusion. And so my core thesis here, I suppose, is that as leaders, our role is to create the space in which great work can happen. To think back to John. I grew up with somebody called Paul Cutler, and so I get John's name wrong all the time because of that. To John's talk earlier, what's the operating system that we've created? And does it encourage all of the right things? Do people understand and believe in why we're doing what we're doing? Autonomy, do they get a say in what? Are their opinions listened to? I think people misunderstand autonomy sometimes as doing whatever you like, and I don't think that's the reality of it. I think it's being influential in the work that you do. Mastery, being proud of how, of the craft, and then inclusion, feeling like you belong, and still taking away any negative factors that detract. And probably my most hippie underlying belief here is that every person is capable of virtuosity. I don't think there's any job in the world that somebody couldn't be brilliant at. There's a wonderful study that Disney did at their parks where they realized that they had certain housekeepers who were wildly better than others. And they tried to work out what was different about them. And the sort of one identifiable thing they could find was that the really great housekeepers cleaned the top of the ceiling fan. And on the one hand, that sounds like something you just add to a checklist and now everybody does it and now everybody's a fantastic housekeeper. And the reality of that was actually that the people who took that action really thought they were part of the magical experience that people were going to have coming to Disney. And they thought about the people who were coming, and this was in the States, so that you had probably a long drive with fractious children in the back seat. It's hot, it's sticky, you've just arrived in the hotel room. What is the first thing you do? You flop down on the bed and you put the fan on. And if the first thing that happens in your magical Disney experience is that you get grit in your eyes from the dirt on top of the fan, that's not very magical and not a great experience. And so folks who, bluntly, a lot of us in knowledge worker roles might look at that job and imagine no one could enjoy it. Actually, people who are in those roles, they can feel like they really are contributing to the purpose of the organization, and that they are proud of the work that they do and how they do it. And so I think that we need to recognize that very few people wake up in the morning aiming for mediocre. I don't think there's many people who go, today I'm aiming for just south of mediocre, and if I can mess everybody else's day up along the way, my day will be perfect. I just don't think there's that many people who are that terrible out there. Everybody wants to be good at what they do, and people are much happier when they're good at what they do, is what the research shows. The third thing that I've learned is that there are inflection points that matter when you're scaling. Semper in excretum sed altua ad variant is always in the shit, just the depth varies in Latin, which weirdly I learned at school. And so different things come for free at different inflection points. If you're very early in your journey and you look at an example of a company that's too far ahead of you, it's not very helpful. I laugh every time I hear a startup, like a really early startup, talking about how they want to develop the way that Google develops things. And I'm like, Google when they were 50 people or Google now? It's a wildly different example depending on which you do. There's also a reality that there's this sort of aspect of inflection points where sometimes you need to be aware of when you're jumping from one context to another. So there are certain things that come for free when you're 10 people in a room. Everybody knows what everybody's doing. Almost no active communication is necessary because you're co-located. Everybody's interested in everybody else's work. You hear things going on, and you're very aware if you're lucky enough to be co-located. The point that you're 50 engineers, suddenly people start asking for career frameworks and whether they're going to get promoted and what's going to happen and what's going on. At 150, you get to what's called Dunbar's number, which is roughly the size that villages tended to be when, in history of humanity, because that's roughly the number of people we can actively maintain relationships with. And not everybody will choose to maintain all those relationships at work. So as soon as you've got a group that's bigger than 150 people, some of them are strangers, and you treat them with the sort of concern that you would any stranger in your life. They're not as trusted, and you're not as intimate with them as you might be if they were closer to you. And so I think the real lesson here is that to focus on the right problems at the right time. Don't look too far ahead. Try to find an organization or a team that's 6 to maybe 18 months ahead of you, and look for inspiration from them, not from somebody who's 10 or 15 years ahead of you, which is, I think, a lot of the time what people are doing when they look at FANG and try to adopt those practices, or even look at Spotify and try to adopt those practices. It's very difficult to do that effectively. The fourth thing I learned is that with people, observability matters a lot more than testing. Sometimes however well we plan, however hard we try, our impact doesn't equal our intent. It's really, really difficult to test people-related things effectively. If you're really lucky, you might be able to change a process in just one team and see if it works, or change a way of working, or a way of evaluating people, or a HR process, or whatever. Sometimes you can pilot something, and that's the closest we ever get to human testing. Probably in a good way. I've just realized how terrible the term human testing sounds, particularly in our current environment. And so we need to regularly check whether what we intended matches up to the actual impact. And so think about all the different ways you have for detecting, for observing what the people-related changes are. So this is a slide from a great talk by Jessie Link, who was VP Eng at Twitter, that she's now at Google, about different types of retros. I think a lot of people get stuck in a rut with retrospectives. They're just doing the what worked well, what didn't, what are we going to change, and when teams become bored with retrospectives, then they often cease to be as useful a tool for iterating and adapting. But there are a ton of different ways of doing retros. This is a liked, lacked, longed for, learned, which is actually also a great exercise to do with somebody when they're trying to figure out what they want from their career. If you can get them to figure out what they've liked, longed for, learned, and lacked in their job role, it can be a really effective learning process as well. There's things like the squad health check model that Spotify wrote about many years ago now. I can't believe that's more than 10 years ago now. Time is a weird soup. There's also things like setting individual team values or attributes and then tracking them over time. This is a slide from Sam Barnes's "People Are Weird and I'm Weird" talk, which has a load of really interesting team iteration ideas in it. And then the fifth thing I learned, possibly unsurprisingly, given I'm basically the one the Daily Mail warns you about, right? I'm an immigrant with a job, I'm queer and neurodiverse and disabled, and I think the having a job thing is better than living off the state, but I kind of have to check the headlines to be sure. My wife's British. I'm over here stealing their women and their jobs. But, you know, so diversity matters a lot to me, partly because I'm very intersectionally diverse. But I think that culture add matters a lot more than culture fit. The unit of delivery fundamentally in all of our work is the team, not the individual. We don't reflect that very well in the systems that we design, in the ways that HR works, in the ways that we evaluate people. But what you need most is a great team, rather than a set of great individuals. Otherwise, you end up with the England football team, the soccer team, that are a bunch of fantastic individuals who have failed to win anything for a very long time. My favorite of those 12 questions we looked at earlier is this one: do I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day? And I think that the real aspiration for all of us as builders of teams, as well as products and systems and people, is to make sure that everybody in a team is having that opportunity to do what they do best every day. So we need to stop leveling people out to consistent mediocrity and get the most out of difference instead. We need a shift in perspective. We're not interchangeable resource units. And I always tell engineers, if their manager refers to them as a resource, to refer to them as overhead until they stop it. It's fairly effective. We're colors or we're flavors. We're better in complement or in concert with each other. I would watch the hell out of a Seven Hulks movie, but the Avengers are interesting because they've got different strengths and abilities rather than all just smashing. So why don't we think of people and roles as a matter of casting, putting the person in the role that really brings out the best in them, where they're their unique attributes, their differences are seen as a feature rather than a bug. And how do we assemble great teams with complementary abilities instead? I don't know if everybody remembers this movie. It came out in 2016, and man babies across the internet lost their minds because Ghostbusters had women in it, and it was ruining their childhoods, apparently. I got a little upset with that, and so I saw this in cinema 11 times, and I took 100 people with me over the course of the 11 times. And so I think there is still a data scientist somewhere in the Odeon, which is the cinema chain here in the UK, who is still wondering about why Ghostbusters ran for 16 weeks at Leicester Square. But turns out if you fill the cinema once a week, it keeps running for another week. By the time we finished, we were being given free posters and popcorn and all sorts of things because they started to recognize us. But fundamentally, teams that are very similar they suck. There's a load of really good research that shows that the more diverse team is, the more likely it is to be commercially successful, innovative, and the less diverse a team is, the more likely it is to have groupthink and to underperform versus diverse teams. And so don't just think about this at the individual level, think of it at the team level. How do you build up teams that are a number of interesting differences stacked together into a set of superpowers? When crafting inclusive environments, I think there's three key questions that everybody's asking themselves, whether they realize it or not. They're asking, am I expected here? Is someone like me even expected to work at this place? I have a physical disability, and some days I can walk, and some days I'm on crutches, and some days I'm worse off than that. And I should probably have a wheelchair, but I don't have one yet. And I have never interviewed anywhere where I knew in advance whether I'd be able to get to the interview room if it was a bad day and I was on crutches. And I've interviewed at a lot of places over the years. I've had quite a long career. And so there's a whole bunch of companies that have given me the impression that disabled people are not expected to apply for jobs, to be in this company at all, because they're so inaccessible, even at the interview stage. Am I respected here is about what we said earlier about, are our differences seen as a feature or a bug? Are people going to interact with us and treat us as a stereotype, or are they going to treat us as ourselves? And then the final one, can I be myself and be successful here? This is the most important one. It's also the hardest to make a change to when you're a leader in an organization. Trying to get a wide range of people to think that they can be themselves and be successful is super important, but very difficult. And it's incredible how much of a difference it can make. There's some research that Stonewall did probably about 20 years ago now that showed that people could be 40% more productive if they could be themselves at work. So that tells you that there's so much energy taken away and used by having to pretend to be something that you're not, having to mask in the modern parlance that we have as neurodiverse people, having to code switch is how people of color tend to talk about it. And so really think about whether you've got an environment where a range of different people can be themselves and be successful. And think about how you show up as leaders as well. It's very easy for leaders to seem very similar and to be very similar. I've worked places where it was very evident that you could find lots of different routes to success because the leadership of the organization was so different from each other. There's also places I have worked where the leadership looked like they were wearing matching underwear to go with their matching ties and suits and haircuts, bluntly. I once was sat in an all hands with about 1,000 other people, and the leadership, the company at the time had a doing things for the first time ad campaign happening. And the ad campaign was like two women in their 80s taking a flight for the very first time in their lives, and it was a really cute ad, and it was really cool watching these ladies take this flight and go overseas for the first time in their lives. And they made the mistake of asking this set of very samey leaders what they were going to do for the very first time in their lives. And the first guy said, make dinner for my family. And there was a bit of a kind of reaction from the audience. And then the next guy said, do laundry. And there was much more of a muttering kind of response, which 1,000 people muttering to themselves is quite a noise to listen to. And I happened to be sat next to the head of diversity and inclusion for this organization. I leaned over and I just went, so Tina, what I'm getting from this is it's a good thing I have a wife already, but she needs to stop with this designing hospitals bullshit. My wife's an architect. And go home and make my dinner and do my laundry. That's how I get on that stage one day, right? And she was just sat with her head in her hands because the next break she had a queue of people coming to complain about how undiverse it was and how demotivating it was for a load of people in the audience, that they couldn't imagine having a life where those were the things you were going to do for the very first time. And so, in summary, dry doesn't work for human communication. Repeat, be consistent, 7+ times. Remember to write ADRs. Someday a software archaeologist will thank you when they inherit your vintage system, if you're lucky enough for it to live that long and need to figure out why you made the decisions you made at the time. Scaling teams is about creating the conditions for success. Purpose, autonomy, mastery, and inclusion are four to think about from the beginning. Inflection points exist. Focus on the right problems at the right times and borrow solutions from folks who are facing your problems, not the problems of 1,000 engineer or 100,000 engineer organization. With people, observability matters more than testing, so use tactics to check whether your impact is matching your intent and adjust. And things like retros can be really useful there, but there's a load of other tools as well. And then culture add matters a lot more than culture fit. Cultivate inclusion, and you'll outperform other teams if you can get this right. We talk a lot about gender in particular in tech, and I joke often that women in tech are like the future. We're just not evenly distributed. I think that you don't, and it's like that story about the guy who stops to put his sneakers on when the lion appears, and the other guy with him is like, what are you doing, man? You're not going to outrun the lion. He goes, I don't need to outrun the lion, I just need to outrun you. We don't need to outrun the lion, we just need to be better than the next team at being inclusive and keeping people in the industry and keeping them productive and good. Cool, and that's it from me. So let's switch over to any questions anybody's got.
Wonderful timing, Meri. Thank you so much. Love the presentation. Oops. I remember sitting in a pizza place in New York City and very unfortunately close to Times Square several years ago, having conversations about exactly these topics. So love to see it. A couple of questions I wanted to hit on. One is that, and this is, you talk a lot about culture differences between perhaps the US and not the US, but perhaps especially between US and Europe. And so one thing that we hear about a lot of Swarmia is that organizations want to measure individual impact, right? And they want to measure individual contributions rather than recognizing that, like you said, the team is the unit. How have you helped teams kind of rethink that mindset, or what have you seen work to maybe shift that thinking more to the team?
So I think understanding how you measure a team's success and it being more than just did they hit their OKRs is really important. So we're increasingly, as you know, we use Swarmia at Pleo, and we're increasingly using those metrics to not be the end of the discussion, but the beginning of the discussion. So we look at the total team, then we look at the individuals within the team, and we do have this question of what is the spike each person brings, what's their brilliance, and how do they contribute to the total of the team. It helps us to recognize things like glue work, which Tanya Riley has written very effectively about, the kind of tasks that keep a team together, keep them functioning really well, but maybe are not individually seem to be as high impact. It helps us to recognize when somebody's got a spike of brilliance in a particular area. And it also helps us have better discussions when we do talk about individual development about what people need to develop at. Because fundamentally, if somebody's really bad at something, getting to okay, getting to mediocre at it takes a huge amount of energy. And often for an organization, it's better to invest that energy that that person's got in getting better in something where they could go from okay to amazing, or from good to fantastic, right? And so that's one of the things that we do. We run calibrations where we talk about individuals in engineering. I've done 40 hours of it this week, which I wouldn't recommend. But part of why part of when we do that is we look at the total team, and then at the individuals within the team, and we have this concept of a controlling weakness. So we only say that somebody has to get good at something that they're really bad at when it's holding them back from being able to do the role. So not every engineer needs to be able to present really well. It may not matter at all in your career that you can't present brilliantly. But if you want to go into DevRel next, then you probably need to get better at presenting, right? It's probably going to become important. Not everybody needs to be able to lead, but at the point that you want to move into a leadership role, then suddenly it is very important, right? I'm worried that I'm diverging from the answer, but I think the fundamental answer is we start by looking at the team as a whole, and then only consider the individual performance after that, by zooming in, and we try to make sure that we're not making everybody the same.
Here's another question that got a bunch of votes. I think it's super valid as we are in remote and hybrid environments more and more. Meri, it looks like you are probably not in an office, or at least not in an office that is outside of your home. You guys still got the Lego collection back. I can't see, it's too small. But it's got lots of votes. How can we effectively observe people, team dynamics, and atmosphere when we are in a hybrid or a remote environment?
So my team is fully remote. I've got people from Cape Town to Toronto, and actually now a bunch of people in Chennai as well. I'm going there next week. And we find that there's quite a lot of clues in Slack, because that's where a lot of teams are interacting and are working. We do regular Peakon surveys, and that tells us quite a bit as well. And we put quite a lot of responsibility on the manager to know how things are going as well. And so sometimes that's them checking the pulse of the team in their stand-ups every day. Sometimes it's about retros. Sometimes it's about other rituals that they might have. But I think that the vibe check is tougher when you're remote, and when everybody in the team is in a different place, it's particularly tough. But I think you look for whether people are creating the opportunities for interaction, even if they don't exist. So are people jumping on I used to have a team that the platform team at Monzo used to have a big screen and a constantly running open Zoom call for everybody. And there were a bunch of people who came to the office every day and they were in the room, and there were a bunch of people who didn't, or were even in other countries, and they, certain times of day, had this sort of very unstructured, just call is open, anybody can chat to anybody. And then if it got very, if it was an intense conversation, they'd take it off to one side and do a one-to-one and that kind of thing. But I think that there's a number of ways. I do think that being remote makes you have to be much more intentional about those things. And I think that's probably the root cause of why, there's some decent evidence that the remote teams might actually be more productive. But I think it's because it forces you to get good at and get quite explicit about how you work and why you work that way. And so the kind of it just magically happens is something that you get for free in an office sometimes. And sometimes you can have people in an office together and they can hate each other's guts and not collaborate effectively at all, right? It can lead to desk wars if they're too close together. So I think it requires you to look in different ways, to have some of these structured surveys and things like that. It requires the manager to pay much closer attention to interactions within the group, and it requires a culture of feedback. It means that the team has to feel comfortable telling each other when things are not good and doing something about it. And so I think one of my personal metrics for whether a team is healthy and how they interact is how productive their retrospectives are. Because I think if you've got a team that can't be honest with each other about that, then whoever's messing with the slides, we can all see that.
It's not me.
All good. Yeah,
It's I want to try and fit in one last question, if I could. This is a little bit of a product specific question, but as you were talking about all of the things that you need to consider in communicating with humans, how do you apply that to when you do need to roll out a big change across an organization? For example, if you're like, oh, guess what, we're going to start using Swarmia now. So because I think that's a question that comes up a lot. How do you do that in a way that is not going to be toxic or disastrous?
Yes. So I'll be honest, it had been implemented just before I arrived at Pleo, so I don't have the personal example from that, but I have other examples. So I tend to start with a really open and honest discussion at an all hands about what we're going to do and why we're going to do it, and immediately try to address some of the conspiracy theories that will immediately arise. Like, we're not going to just measure you on how many pull requests you've got. We're not going to look at Swarmia and decide that you're useless based on your cycle time just because you've got to do more research than some other team has got to, or you've got to deal with MasterCard and they are not the fastest and their development process, and those kind of things. And so start with a big kind of public announcement, be very clear, nobody can not know that it's happening. Follow up with the managers and making sure that they are all really clear on what it will and won't be used for, so that they can reassure people in one-to-ones, and then start showing how we use it. So one of the main uses I've got for Swarmia is that we've improved our throughput by 312% in the last 2.5 years. Our cycle times come down by 40%, and those are graphs I take to the board. And I'm super open with my engineers that that's part of how the board has an idea about whether we're getting better as an organization, is whether these metrics get better. And I run the risk that maybe they'll try to game it. But the thing I love best about the Dora metrics, and thank you so much for this, Nathan, is that even when people try to game it, it still has a positive impact. Oh no, you're dividing your work into smaller PRs. Oh no, you're releasing your work more regularly in smaller pieces that reduces risk. Oh no, we're working on stuff much faster and getting it out the door to customers. Like, it kind of doesn't hurt if people try to game those metrics. Is the other upside, I think.
Right. Well, Meri, thanks as always for joining us. Always enjoy hearing your perspective and hearing your evolving perspective on this topic, 8 years later. So this has been great. I don't know if you can hang out for questions in the chat.
Sure, and I will try to answer the questions written
yes.
In a moment. So thanks very much.
Amazing. All right. Well, up next is our panel discussion. And this is the part where I'm supposed to share this. Here we go.